Hello and welcome to session 315 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing International Agreements on AI Safety, Review and Recommendations for a Conditional AI Safety Treaty by Rebecca Scholefield, Samuel Martin and Otto Barton. Like in the last session, I find it instructive to start by analyzing the conception of AI risk that is given by the authors. So at the top, there is loss of control to power-seeking AI, which is something that the authors label as clearly important. I won't reference the authors, I'll just attribute everything here to the first author, Rebecca Scholefield. Loss of control to power-seeking AI is the central risk that I care about. The second layer is malicious users, such as the AI assisting with cyber attacks or biological weapons or even fake news. I'm less enthusiastic about these because while they are easier to measure and easier to notice, they are only really a correlated proxy for loss of control. The third level is malfunction risks, including biases, but also things like self-driving cars running down pedestrians. I think industry and just normal regulation will be sufficient for handling this risk. And there is a value in not having too large a conception of risk. So this is the area where the authors cut reality. So let's talk about some things that they don't think are AI risks. And these are things like systemic risks, such as market distortions at the labor market in particular, the environment, and all kinds of impact on society at scale. And I also agree this isn't the central part of AI risk, but when we make a treaty or design a treaty, we need to consider political expediency, and something like unemployment might really be a popular addition to this. So in that way, I'm somewhat conflicted here. I don't feel the treaty cuts reality at the joints, and that's of course something that feels bad. But on the other hand, there is a political process involved in actually getting a treaty ratified. So it's hard for me to judge how fatal this objection really is. Okay, so there are some risks from advanced AI, but why do we need an international treaty? Why can't our existing structures handle this challenge? I wish the authors had spent some more time here because many of these risks are things that are already illegal. So why do we need new laws and treaties? They do have some arguments. For instance, competitive pressure is one reason. AI development holds great promise, and there's a real fear of missing out among countries. Another problem is that compliance verification might require things like custom inspections at international borders, and that's another thing where treaties could be helpful. A final reason for an international treaty is when the benefits are local and the harms accrue to the entire world, we're in a classical failure. But I do in fact think that the harms also very strongly accrue locally. So this isn't, I feel, enough to really justify an AI treaty. The core problem, as I see it, is that AI existential risk is a really, really difficult subject that we understand poorly. And it's this lack of understanding that necessitates a greater amount of safety. Rebecca Scholefield pointed out that existing organizations and treaties could, in theory, be reinterpreted to deal with AI safety. And I think this is a really good point. She mentioned some organizations, and I want to specifically point to NATO, because my reading of NATO's Article 4 is that this is something that really clearly deals with power-seeking AI. So NATO could, in fact, do this. And I think existing and national organizations have many advantages, including just established credibility, right? If NATO says something is important, then people listen. NATO has a lot of tools. Treaties don't spring up from nothing. The authors identify 5 key underpinning processes that enables an international AI safety treaty. The first is building a scientific consensus about the risks of takeover from advanced artificial intelligence. Rebecca suggests formal multi-party reports from established organizations like the UN could be used to show the scientific consensus for policymakers, which some people call this an actual prerequisite. And I feel a key challenge here is that we could perhaps get a consensus on the risk being substantial, but it's such a difficult area that we won't get anything near the kind of scientific consensus that we saw on climate change. Another process that we could do is setting standards. These could be like for terminology or how to evaluate models for risk, risk management in general. And I think of these, terminology is by far the most important. And this is something that we need to get from a process that excludes the key frontier labs. I want to highlight how the authors use GPAI, general purpose AI. People used to call this AGI, but we've lost the battle for the definition of AGI, and seeding the ground, the terminological grounds, is a crucial problem. The third underlying process is to figure out how to audit these models and how to audit the frontier labs. Rebecca suggests that these audits should be done by a third party, and that seems like a really trivial requirement. I get the feeling that it's kind of standing with faint praise to suggest this, because that's obviously the smallest thing. My central problem with audits is different. We simply do not have good enough interoperability research to do some actual white box audits. And that means that our ability to get meaningful levels of safety from audits is just not there. A fourth thing is to figure out how we will in fact verify compliance with a treaty. For hardware-constrained AIs, the authors suggest that the supply chain would be the easiest place to monitor. Sure, but I think the role of the police and intelligence services should be highlighted more, because they are in fact much easier, much more well-positioned to find criminals. And the fifth part is to think hard about how can we incentivize compliance to any treaty, both among the companies and incentivize countries to ratify it. And there are a number of potential benefits from AI. On the input side, it could be access to technical talent or hardware if you sign the contract and if the companies behave towards the National AI Safety Institute. On the output side, perhaps we could have an agreement that shares the benefit of AI or gives differential trade access. That has been very helpful historically. In my analysis, the stronger the political will behind the treaty, the less incentivizing is really required to cause compliance, because like you don't actually need that much incentivizing to not do crime. So of these 5 key underpinning processes, there are at least 3 of them that we really can't do, and possibly more. And that is a very serious problem, and that's a discussion we need to face up to. What developers of AI models should an AI treaty target? Well, they should only target some. And this is a point that is really central to the authors. So they want to name the entire treaty conditional. So I'm a bit confused here, and I notice that I'm confused because there's a sense that all laws are conditional in a very broad sense, right? But perhaps the conditional here is to say that this is a very narrowly targeted treaty to make it more palatable. I'm somewhat confused here. So I think the best way to distinguish regulated from unregulated models, or that according to the authors, is to have a clear quantifiable limit. And this will probably necessarily be by proxies, because like you can't actually measure will this model take over, right, in a meaningful way. And of course, proxies have a number of problems. We know that. And so the limits are, well, the classic limit is the amount of compute, but it could also be things like the number of parameters or the amount of training data. I think the compute both for training and for deployment are important, and it may be worthwhile to distinguish the two here. Sorry. Alternatively, we might look at requiring models, regulating the models that fulfill some qualitative criteria. This could be architecture, the algorithm used, or the capabilities. Sorry. I would highlight here the capabilities on Bostrom's 6 strategic cognitive domains, which are the causal path towards an AI takeover. Like most everyone else, the authors settle on a compute threshold, though they acknowledge the limitation of this. And though I agree, I think we really need to be explicit about the limitations, because if we have a very poor proxy for the actual level of danger, well, then we need to have a dramatically more restrictive level of regulation. And these thresholds also need to be, it needs to be possible to revise them down if new evidence arises. The authors suggest that National AI Safety Institute could be up to this task. I think in fairness, as Bayesians, we should not expect to receive a particular kind of evidence. There's just as large a chance of a decrease. Otherwise, we should update already. Excuse me for a moment. Oh, my throat is having some problems, apparently. Yeah. So I think we should consider going with an explicit reference to capabilities. Even though it is a lot harder to measure, it is capabilities that the labs obviously are going for. For a lab that is targeted by this regulation, what should be the consequences? What should the regulation actually do? So the way the authors describe the effects is somewhat unstructured. So I've tried to superimpose my own structure based on how I read this. So in my reading, for a model to be trained, it gets kind of what you could call a safety score, which is how much compute do we use, how much capability do we expect, minus some safety work, which determines like the effect of the regulation. So the safety work here is mostly evals, because that's the key thing that's done right now. But it's also things like a safety culture and governance, and also all other kinds of safety work. Safety work might also include things like formal structured safety cases, such as guaranteed safe AI, for extremely dangerous models. I think the authors are a bit coy here, in that we don't have anything like this, and we're not going to have guaranteed safe AI anytime soon. So if we are requiring an unreachable high bar, it will probably not be reached. So the lowest level, any frontier model that is above a very low limit, must be reported to a National AI Safety Institute, so it can get this what I call a safety score. But this isn't something that the authors focus very much on. So if we have a larger training run, then more safety evaluation needs to be done to get permission to deploy it. And if the model is even more capable or use even more compute, then a correspondingly larger amount of safety effort is required just to be able to develop the model. In my world, there's not a very large difference between being allowed to deploy a model and being allowed to develop a model, because for the sake of takeover, these are roughly identical. And so you could have even larger and even more dangerous training runs. In this case, a treaty could require that this may only be done in a centralized fashion, like at a National AI Safety Institute or a multinational consortium. Rebecca mentions this as a possibility, and many people have done this, but she doesn't quite come to the level of endorsing this level. I don't think I would endorse it either, but I think the arguments are really non-trivial, and I think this is an area that's worth exploring. And of course, there is some combination of like very large compute and insufficient security, where an AI safety treaty should just prohibit the training full stop. And I think this is great, but there is one step you could potentially go further, right? And that is halting research, or at least prohibiting publication of research. That's what Pause AI's treaty proposal does. And I think at some level of risk, this is obviously required. And that is in fact a can of worms, but it is a can of worms that we may have to open at some point. Another novel question the authors, well, novel to me, right, discuss is whether this is best achieved within a standard international treaty, because we have a number of other options. And I've tried to structure them, kind of ordering them according to my judgment of how effective they're going to be. So this isn't like, I'm not really following the paper very closely here. So the lowest level, well, that's kind of the thing we have, right? Where there's like voluntary, high-level, non-binding statements about safety, which is, you know, better than nothing, but not a lot, right? But we can get more formal and more effective by shoehorning existing organization into managing international cooperation on AI safety. That is a possibility, but it's likely going to be ineffective. We could, in fact, have conventions that are unratified and maybe even not even written down, but just de facto come into place. And these things can, in fact, be surprisingly effective. Another option is to have broad and multi-level framework conventions, which describe how future agreements can be made. And that's an interesting option. It kind of sidesteps all the hard parts, or rather, points them to later. And I think we shouldn't discount that too early. Rebecca notes that this approach has been quite effective for climate change. So the first level where we are like really talking about something binding is with one or several bilateral treaties. And these are potentially a lot easier to negotiate than like very big multilateral treaties. And as the authors note, a treaty between the US and China that basically solves 80% of the problem. So maybe that is in fact a lot easier. So the next level above this is like the International AI Safety Treaty, an international, which is like the institutional arrangement that is most widely recognized as the one we should go to. There's a level above this where countries devolve some of their sovereignty to a supranational AI safety organization that is created by some treaty possibly. On this scale, for any of these, Rebecca assigns a very large role to national AI safety institutes, even though these organizations might, of course, also work together. And I think this kind of national laws, like SB 1047, are the kind of institutional arrangement that feeds into a lot of this. These treaties, and they may in fact be something that needs to happen first. The last part of the article describes some recommendations for an AI safety treaty. I must admit, I actually thought from the abstract that they would come out with an AI safety treaty. They didn't do that, they just have some recommendations. So for variation, I took their recommendation, fed that into ChatGPT, and I managed to get a draft of a treaty. Where I wasn't really that impressed with what ChatGPT gave me just based on that. But I think I prefer engaging with a concrete proposal, because like the things that ChatGPT struggled with, and that may in fact be things that are quite problematic. So without further ado, I present the Copenhagen Convention on Conditional Artificial Intelligence Safety. So this is the preamble, as such things are, right? I don't really recommend reading it. I haven't even carefully read all the details myself, but I rather note that this is more of a framework convention that is being described here rather than an explicit hard law treaty. And that is to a large extent because the authors find that it's really too early to give specific quantitative limits. More research needs to be done. I think I would disagree with this. I think we can in fact be concrete now. And I think I would call upon the authors to specifically state what research results would be needed here. Because I think we do in fact know enough now to have a reasonable idea about what things are unsafe. Another thing that the authors say that the preamble should do, I think they actually quote someone else who says this, is to include the positive effects of artificial intelligence. And that's not really obvious because you might believe that the benefits are already really well appreciated and the risks are not. And certainly this could easily send the wrong signals. So the first real section of the treaty is the establishment of compute threshold, or rather the delegation of this later work to AI safety institutes. So there is no immediate specification here. So the desiderator for thresholds are that they're detectable, excludable, and quantifiable. And ChatGPT also makes them objectively verifiable here. And that kind of ends up excluding the very subjective intelligence capability measures that represents the actual risk in lieu of just proxies. Another desiderator is that the treaty should have no exemptions. And I want to highlight this because I think this is really important. This is an explicit refutation of the claim that things will go well if it's the good guys who do it. And I think this is great, and this is something that needs to be highlighted even more. The second part is about the requirement for audits. Rebecca rejects black box audits. They are insufficient and requires either gray box, which is somewhat ill-defined, or white box access to the model. So at least certainly access to the model weights. I want to object here with my belief that currently we don't really have any way to get any kind of reasonable safety about what's really going on inside these gargantuan floating point matrices. The interoperability research is just not there. So the auto-generated text that I have here, it doesn't really reflect this, but my reading of the recommendations from the authors is that they believe that if the AI safety institutes believe that training a model is safe, they can go ahead. And if they believe it's unsafe, they will require a pause of some kind. And I think this leaves quite unclear the situations where you are doing some audits, but you can't conclude either that it's safe or that it's unsafe. I think this is the default state. And we should think about what actually happens if the answer is we don't know. The treaty recommendation also contains another options, the structured formal safety cases. The way this is optional feels a bit strange to me in that it's like juxtaposing the really obvious requirement of a safety case with kind of the realizations that we can't really get those. And I think that's the central contradiction of this section, that if we actually require some kind of reasonable safety, well, that is functionally identical to requiring a pause. There's a part about security and governance in the recommendations. I won't go into a lot of details, but I do notice that Rebecca seems to give this kind of security, information security, safety culture, and governance substantial weight in this treaty. And I give it a lot less weight. I think the risk from power-seeking AI is 95% capabilities and just 5% of these incidental control measures. It's really unclear why this matters. The fourth part of the recommendation is about reporting requirements. So we already have a well-developed Know Your Customer KYC framework, and that is something we may be able to leverage for controlling compute and chips. There's a lot of focus in the recommendations on like small scale compute and cloud compute and small models. I think this is less relevant because my threat model is like Anthropic DeepMind and OpenAI and basically no one else. I think the risk from these small open source models is negligible. So in general, I expect this to hold. I expect the strongest model to always be the most dangerous. And that makes this part of the treaty mostly irrelevant in practice. The last of the central parts of the treaty is about verification and enforcement. And the suggestions pretty closely mirror other international treaties, which is like totally reasonable from that perspective. But I think seeing this more as a criminal matter is a better alternative, because that leaves the enforcement much more to organizations like the FBI in the United States, which seems like an organization that is much better placed to this kind of thing. Rebecca suggests the creation of an international inspection authority, which is again a pattern that's been successfully used in other similar treaties. An underlying difference here is that I really only see such a treaty being ratified if the governments already are convinced and thus they already want to enforce it, which is kind of in contrast to the situation around nuclear weapons, for instance. Here, ChatGPT generated some final clauses, which I expect are like boilerplate stuff. So let's look at the meta level at this point. Can we in fact get this treaty ratified? Rebecca sees some encouraging signs from like the public statements of the major AI labs, where I must admit I've grown to become much more cynical about them. I expect empty words and a continuation of their policy of resisting meaningful regulation. A special consideration is that the treaty really needs to be signed by both the US and China, because otherwise it can't really prevent an AI arms race. And unfortunately, with the current administration being strongly anti-AI safety, that does seem unlikely. So what do we do now? I think we need some kind of discussion about the path forward. Rebecca is sanguine in acknowledging that the risk perception must change substantially before it's feasible to get a treaty ratified. I suspect that could be like a warning shot or a fire alarm. And conditioning on a warning shot or a fire alarm, we may in fact be looking at a very different kind of treaty. Moving to my conclusions, in the recent and, in my opinion, very reasonable AI 2027 scenario, treaties end up mostly not being relevant. And so I don't obviously have a proof of this, but I get the feeling that the authors are implicitly thinking about scenarios where there are much longer timelines than this. And like if we have several decades, then a conditional treaty like this does seem like an important tool for safety. But if we have a reasonably weak treaty, like this is pointing towards, then it needs to be ratified well in advance. But if the timelines are shorter, if we're closer to the precipice, then we do need substantially stronger treaties. So I see three things that could give us a pause. One is we somehow get better arguments for AI X risk. Two, we get some public pressure. And three, some kind of fire alarm. And we may, in fact, right now, we should consider preparing an 11th hour AI safety treaty, because we may in fact have very little time to negotiate it later. So of these, I think a fire alarm is the most likely, and we should consider treaties that have that as an overall assumption. Like in case of fire, break glass, and there's a treaty there ready for people to ratify. But that's of course really non-trivial, because that implies that we are predicting the future, and there may in fact this fire alarm may be an immediate threat. So writing this treaty may in fact be really hard, but I do think that this is in fact our best and most realistic option for an international AI safety treaty. This concludes my presentation on international agreements on AI safety, review and recommendations for a conditional AI safety treaty. See you again on the 1st of May. Ceterum censeo, machinam sapientem esse delendam.